There we go. Can everybody see it? Oh, you can't say because you've got your mute on. Okay, right, I'll just get started then. So thank you for inviting me today. I'm here to talk about fabricated or induced illness, which is the topic of my PhD that I'm in the first year of. Just got to move the controls around, it's blocking my slide. Okay, right, so my position answer. So I'm an autistic parent to 2 autistic children myself, and I recently did a master's in autism, which I did at Sheffield Hallam, and for the dissertation I researched autistic parenthood, the pros and cons of being an autistic parent, which just got published this year. And one of the people in that, one of my participants, had been accused of, it was Munchausen syndrome by proxy at the time, which is a kind of the same thing, but FII is sort of an expanded version. They're bringing more and more into it, but Munchausen syndrome by proxy was what it was called at the time this lady was accused. And so that was where my interest came, and I started to hear more about it and more parents who were getting accused. So I have the academic knowledge, I've got my lived experience, and also I engage with autistic, disabled and chronically ill people really often online and face to face. And I think that's one of the differences when you compare it to sometimes like the medics who only get the one perspective of being a professional. So I think it puts me in a good position to research this subject, hopefully. So just a quick disclaimer, it's my views, not my universities or anyone who I work with. My knowledge has come, as I explained, from academic knowledge and lived experience. But I'm not legally or medically qualified, and wherever I mention names, they're not real names or anything that might identify somebody. I've changed it. So I've got a few examples in here. So what is fabricated or induced illness? Well, I'll start by going through a couple of the definitions. So this is the NHS website, what it says at the moment. Fabricated or induced illness is a rare form of child abuse. It occurs when a parent or carer, usually the child's biological mother, exaggerates or deliberately causes symptoms of illness in the child. So it says that it's child abuse. It's often seen as child abuse, and it's nearly always the mother who gets accused, but it isn't always the mother. And you do hear of it in dads too, because I noticed there was somebody in the chat who's a dad. And it's basically when you're being accused of making up the child's symptoms, either exaggerating them or being overly anxious and worrying and trying to make it seem worse than it is, so that you get more help from the doctors or might be schools, not necessarily doctors. But since recently there's been a new definition that was published this year by the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health, and I'll read theirs out too. FII is a clinical situation in which a child is or is very likely to be harmed due to parents' behaviour and action, carried out in order to convince doctors that the child's state of physical and or mental health or neurodevelopment is impaired, or more impaired than is actually the case. FII results in emotional and physical abuse and neglect, including iatrogenic harm. So it's the same thing, but slightly more carefully worded, so it doesn't actually call it child abuse. And they include the fact that or more impaired than is actually the case, because having a diagnosis for something doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to be accused of FII, because they'll say you're exaggerating it sometimes. You often hear it called other things, and that helps to confuse. The literature is really confused and contradictory, and it's got a lot of things to critique about it. But if I just go through a bit of the terminology, in factitious disorder imposed on another is what's in the DSM-5, so that's the psychiatric condition. They're all essentially the same thing, but just with slight differences. And for that, you need to have deliberate deception, and you need to be able to prove deliberate deception. And I think probably partly because to make it easier to prove, they didn't want that in FII. So FII, you don't have to deliberately prove deception. All you have to be able to say is that for the doctor to say this child has got nothing wrong with them, or is not as bad as the mum is making out, and then that's enough. That's seen as evidence. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Most places you read, they'll say you have to have deliberate deception, like factitious disorder imposed on another. However, in the most recent guidance, it says you don't need that. It says it's a synonym for fabricated or induced illness, which is a problem because they're then using evidence from Munchausen syndrome by proxy to support FII, which is just not comparable. Perplexing presentations is a term introduced when they're saying it's kind of like supposed to be spotting FII earlier. So they call it perplexing presentations, and it's supposed to like not blame the parent. But in reality, it seems to be talked about as if it is the beginnings of FII. So they are blaming the parent in a lot of the literature. And the medical child abuse tends to get used in American literature more. But these are just some of the terms. There's actually quite a lot more and different spellings and everything. So it's very confusing. And everybody's talking about slightly different things. It's really a big mess, the literature. And which feeds into practice, of course. So most of what you find in the literature is medical literature. So it's nearly all case studies, and they're all written by doctors. The parent voice is missing, and that's what I would hope to address in my research. And the problem with medical literature is you have a lot of the social context missing. So it might say things like, if you've got a parent who they keep missing the child's appointments, but then if you don't see the social context, it could be that they also have 3 disabled children, and then sometimes it's impossible to get to doctor's appointments because you have meltdowns or other things to do with school issues or not having butler. So it's one of the problems with medical literature is it misses out a lot of important context. And when you read through it, one of the things that stood out to me straight away was how it discriminates autistic people. So some places it will actually say, if you're autistic, you're more likely to do FII. But more often than not, it's more that it's saying, it points things out that are different about the person, which suggests to me that they might be autistic, but they don't actually mention autism. So it'll be things like personality disorder comes up a lot, and that's a common misdiagnosis for autism. Things like they have relationship problems with the parents, like the grandparents, or the emotional reaction wasn't seen as appropriate. And one of any research that's in there is mostly just systematic reviews of case studies. So they're all case studies which doctors have chosen as interesting ones and publish them. It's a doctor's view of them. And then when they do reviews and this is seen as research, they're just looking at that bias sample. There is quite a lot of critique, mainly older critique for Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but it's nearly all in non-medical journals like Legal and Feminist, and so some of it is really interesting, and it really points out all of the issues, but it just doesn't get cited in medical literature. It's just almost ignored. And there's starting to be more critical papers being written recently as well. Like there's Andy Bilson, Luke Clements have been writing things. Fiona Gullen Scott wrote something about FII and autism. So we're starting to see more appearing in the literature. We need so much more that's like counteracting the medical literature. So perspectives, this is what you would say in the guidance that professionals are supposed to follow, and throughout the literature since like the last few decades, the sort of things you see is they'll say that the perpetrator is nearly always female. Well, first I'll start by explaining why I've got the warning on. So the evidence for these things is circular, and what I mean by that is you training people and teaching professionals to look out for FAI by using these characteristics. So then what happens is they get spotted as being, these could be high risk for FAI. And once that, then they're more likely to be accused. And then once you get accused of it, everything gets seen through that lens, in that context. People are more suspicious of you, more wary, and it's really hard, which I'll talk about later, to disprove it, because the way that everything you might use to disprove it is something that then gets used against you. Like, for example, getting a second opinion, that's got seen as doctor shopping, and that's what you would do if you got FAI, even though it's also what you would do if you don't believe, if you think your doctor's wrong, then the child does have a genuine condition. So what happens is once you're accused, then those people are the ones more likely to go through the system and then become what's called a confirmed case. And confirmed case is either the parent admits it or a court finds them that it is FII. But that's a load of rubbish too, because you don't, if your child has been taken off you, then you don't get them back unless you will admit it, that you've done something wrong, and go through all of the rehabilitation therapies, that kind of thing. So people who haven't done anything wrong are going to admit it. That's what you would do if you want to get your child back and keep them safe. So I don't think that the confessions are reliable, and also even just because a court finds agrees with what the paediatrician says, all through the process there's discrimination, it's unfair, there's power imbalances. People haven't necessarily got the time because they get surprised by the accusations sometimes. They don't have the knowledge, don't necessarily have money for solicitors, so it's completely unfair process if you haven't got people supporting you. So I don't think you can rely on the fact that no or minimal miscarriages of justice have happened. So then that ends up that a subset of the people who are accused will meet this criterion. When you then do research on the confirmed cases, it's just confirming what they had in this list. So it's circular, and I don't believe the list at all, and it needs some proper research behind it. The kind of things that you see anyway, it's nearly always female apparently, but there's loads of evidence of medical misogyny, women being less likely to be believed just generally in medicine. Plus also it's more likely to be the mum who's going in as the main carer, so you would expect it to be more women just for that reason. Medical knowledge is something that can make you more likely to be accused. So I can't remember the exact amount, but Fightback did a bit of a survey. They're a group, they have a Facebook group. They did a survey of their members, of people who've been accused, and a really high proportion of them, 25%, I've got it written down, were medical professionals, so often nurses, because having medical knowledge is seen as making you more likely to do FII. Childhood adverse, that's also, I think, puts autistic people more at risk, because we are really good at researching things. So I'll often will have loads of knowledge on something because I've got really interested in it. Childhood adversity, quite common in autistic families too. Fictitious disorders in the parent as well. So they're saying that as well as making things up in your child, you're making things up in yourself. But actually that could just be that there's a genetic thing going on. So autism runs in families, EDS runs in families, because EDS is something that seems to be related to FII a lot, because it's really hard to diagnose. It can take like 10 years to get diagnosis, and in the meantime it just looks like lots of unrelated symptoms. Things like receiving disability benefits is seen as one of the characteristics, but most families with disability receive them. So personality disorders I already mentioned. So a lot of these things that are listed as characteristics of the perpetrator are just things that happen when you're part of a disabled or chronically ill family. so we are at more risk. So this slide is quite old because it's from 2004. However, I've seen glazers say in as late as 2016, and there's lots of literature that's new, which says the same sort of thing. And you can see that this is training that was done. They actually specify autism as a reason why a mum might make up symptoms in their child. But there's really no evidence of that at all. But if professionals are being taught that an autistic mum is more likely to be a FII perpetrator, then that adds stigma to being an autistic mum, and it means you're more likely to get accused, obviously. So that's part of the issue. Anxiety, that I heard that loads. Oh, do you think that she's just anxious because you're anxious, or she's copying you? Very common. You hear people saying that all the time. Deflecting blame from the mother, so basically saying you're a bad parent, you can't control your kid, so you're just making up that they're autistic. But I don't know if people have heard of the refrigerator mum theory. It used to be that, or be believed that autistic people were autistic because of the cold mothers, not giving them enough love. It's basically just that still lingering around, blaming the mum. So the kind of things that you're looking for, these are what they call alerting signs, and the things that doctors are going to be looking out for. And you'll notice that all of these things are the sort of thing that could be explained by the fact that you've got a child with a medical condition, or who is not getting the support that they need. So the parent repeatedly reports new symptoms, as you would if you're a good parent. You take them to the doctor when you keep seeing new symptoms. And this, something like EDS is a problem for this, because another thing it said was when the symptoms don't make sense or seemingly unrelated. But with EDS, you can have it's multisystemic, so you can have a real range, like pain, things to do, like bowel issues, joints dislocating. But also, a lot of people who are autistic have, we've got lots of things related that co-occur with autism. So I don't know many people who are just autistic. Like, I've got myotonic dystrophy, a kind of muscular dystrophy. I've got mental health things going on. I have bowel issues, and I don't know anyone who's just got autism. And so it looks like you're making up lots of different things because they're so different, but that's actually quite common. So you've also, we've got epilepsy as another one that gets mentioned in the literature, because the doctor doesn't see a seizure unless you just happen to have one when you're there, but you're only in the doctor's surgery for half an hour. It's anything where you can't see it, so pain related, migraines. So parent repeatedly reporting new symptoms is a sign. Going to the doctors a lot. Doctor shopping, as they call it. So if you're not happy with what one doctor says, going and getting another opinion, or getting private opinions. Not accepting reassurance, as you wouldn't if you think the doctor's wrong. Not letting the child be seen on their own. That's an interesting one, because when you've got a child with, in our case, we've got autistic children, but even a child who's just anxious, you might be worried about letting the child be seen on their own. It doesn't necessarily mean you've got something to hide. Frequent vexatious complaints. Who says the vexatious? You can see it's just a list of things that basically means that the doctor doesn't agree with you, but you would still do it. That you can't discriminate. If you find something where all these things are happening, I don't think you can really discriminate. Is it because it's FII, or is it because there's an undiagnosed condition going on that hasn't been spotted? So you get these alerting signs all over the literature, and I put Bilson on the bottom, his reference, because he did a good response, which is on his website, where he responded to the new guidance. And it's got lots of critique in it. So it's not, it's not the epidemiology, how often does FII happen? One of the problems with that is that they use evidence based on Munchausen's by proxy, which is different because anxiety is included in FII. It's really old research from the 90s, and it was looking at things like under 5-year-olds and the guidance. So basically the research they use, which is very little, is not, you can't use it for FII because it's just totally different population of people and different circumstances. It's not generalizable. You often, as I've been reading the literature, it's amazing how often you see these mortality rates mentioned. And again, they're really old rates that are out of date and that are flawed. And it doesn't include, nowadays we're looking at just anxious parents getting included in the definition for FII, which wasn't the case. So I just think they're miles out. It's something like 6 to 10% that you often, 6 to 9% that you often see quoted, which is just not true. When they also don't look at things like the mortality rate. If you're going to look at the mortality rate of FII, you also should be looking at the mortality rate of the false accusations of FII. What happens when it turns out somebody's medical needs are being missed because it's been blamed on FII instead? Who's counting that, the mortality rates of that? Plus, it's actually very hard to work out what is FII. When people have done freedom of information requests from LAs, but they don't record it to that level of detail. But it was Bilson, I think, looked at the last couple of years. He went in, it's publicly available information, to look for deaths from FII, and he didn't find any at all. He found 2 where FII was mentioned, but they didn't die from the FII. One was a suicide, and I think the other one might have been a heart condition or something. So undoubtedly the death rates are miles out, and people should stop using them. But also, if that gets used in court, like, I don't know if it does, and I'd be interested as I do my research to find out if that ever gets quoted in, those death rates get quoted in court. Because if you put that in front of a judge who think it's FII and there's a 6 to 9% chance of death, of course they're going to have to take the child into care. But that's miles out, and a parent doesn't have a chance to defend themselves because they're not going to have all this knowledge. And so they won't know why, they won't be able to say, and they also don't have the time to find out because it's often all done very quickly. Another problem is, it bundles together those with deliberate deception by parents and those who just believe a diagnosis is incorrect. That's what FII does now in the guidance now, whereas before it was supposed, with Munchausen by proxy, it was supposed to be just those where there's deliberate deception. And I think that's about making it easier to, not really to prove. They do, it is to make it easier to prove, but the proof is just the doctors say so. It just removes that extra layer of evidence that they needed, so it makes it more scary for parents, basically. I think it's becoming just a catch-all for whenever things can't be diagnosed, then if they can't think of what it could be, then it gets called FII. So why are they a concern at the moment? Well, we think anecdotally that they're on the increase, but it's hard to get evidence for that because, like I said, it's not always recorded in that level of detail. In the Fightback group where they did the survey, 70% of them have been cleared, and bearing in mind that, I mean, that a lot of them will be ongoing and will end up being cleared. It does seem from anecdotally that a lot of people, they do end up being cleared because there really isn't anything to it. But I guess hopefully I'll find out more about that when I do my research and hear people's stories. But sometimes it does go far enough that people have their children taken away. But it seems like they're on the increase and they're starting to be more in the media. I think some of it is about, we're in a sort of very risk-averse society. So things like baby P, and we've just had another one recently where social services think things get missed. And so when and then there's a big media outcry, and then people are like, oh, really sort of people become really risk averse, and then you end up having lots of procedures and safeguarding, and you're not giving social workers options to like use their brain a bit and put more thought into it. So it's like they're too scared of making a mistake, so they think that to be on the safe side, you sort of rescue the child. And I don't think often enough that the harm that is done by intervening is considered. So they look at the harm that they think that they perceive that they're saving the child from, but they don't look at the harm that's being caused, because it's a very traumatic process for the family. And when the parents are going through a traumatic process, it does affect the child as well. So you often hear, I heard a radio interview about it, and one of the things that the lady was saying on it was Danny Glazer again, she was saying, we've heard a lot about the parents, but not about the child, and we're here for the child. But the truth is, I don't think you can split it up as easily as that, because the family is a unit, and if the parent is traumatized, that does impact on the child. If they're not able to access healthcare because they're too scared because of these processes, that affects the child. So I don't really buy that excuse. It's important that children are protected, but you've got to get it right. You can't just be trying to be on the safe side and assuming it's a safe side to go in and intervene. So here's a few of the worries specifically for autistic families. A lot of the guidance and things talks about normal behaviour. So when you've admitted as a parent that it's FII, then they have to work on getting the child back to normality so that they can recover from this problem. But for some of us, normality doesn't work anyway. Our house, a lot of things we do would be seen as abnormal, but that we do what works for us as an autistic family. So that one of my children was wearing onesies until quite an old age. The other one hardly ever goes out, but he's happy. He just doesn't want to go out. It's not that he can't. And it'll say things like, make sure the child's doing social things again. It's like, that just doesn't, it's not what my son wants or needs. So they're trying to get them back to normal when maybe normal is not what is good for them. So we'd be having to comply with all of these things that I would know isn't what's right for our family, but you have to comply. Consider the child's symptoms in the context of normal behaviour and physiology at the child's development age. Well, autistic people develop at different rates. Sometimes they're way ahead, sometimes they're way behind. So comparing it to the normal behaviour for that child's development does not work for autistic people. So there's a lack of autism understanding in, I don't know what the word, in the rehabilitation, in the bits, once you've admitted that you've been doing FII and they're trying to get everything back to normal, I would be worried. I think a lot of autistic families, they always have this balance of what appears to be normal, because you don't want to be judged negatively, and what you actually know is right for your child. They may not always be the same. You're always having to play that balance. In my research, this was a quote from one of my participants, the one who got accused. She said, "It was out of their understanding of how people operate, and my reactions to things weren't how people normally operate. So they knew there was something, and looking back, I can see why they came to the conclusions that they did." So she now knows that she's autistic, but she didn't at the time. But looking back, she said she thinks that was probably what was the issue. So she was behaving in an unusual way. And if you don't recognise autism, as many people didn't back then, and even now don't, especially in women, then looking different leads to suspicion. And she said at the time there was lots of training on Munchausen by proxy, so that was what the conclusion that they jumped to. And then another problem is it sticks, so the suspicion follows the parent around. And you can kind of understand why so the first comment is about If the child goes to another doctor, then the concerns have to be passed on to the new doctor. You can understand why that's needed. If there was genuine FII, they need to know. But the problem is, it means every time you get looked at by a new doctor, instantly they're looking through the FII lens and you're not taken seriously or believed. This same participant said, even after it was proved that I didn't have Munchausen by proxy, there were still interactions with professionals where there was no doubt that they still believed it. So she had a forensic psychologist do a report that said the children were doing really well. There was definitely no Munchausen by proxy, was really supportive, but she still was worried. She still said she could tell some people didn't believe what she was saying, and she basically was unable to access healthcare because she was just too scared they'd all start up again. So she didn't go wherever possible unless it was really serious. Why are we having so many accusations? Well, people don't understand autism is one of the reasons. So you often got genuine misunderstandings. Why is someone behaving strangely? It could be something simple like, why aren't they giving eye contact? It might be because they're autistic and anxious and they can hear better when they don't give eye contact, but it looks like it's shifty or suspicious for people who don't understand autism. Masking, so things like when they say fine in school, but then you're saying that they're not fine at home, the anxiety's coming out at home. People who know about autism know that that's really common. It's called masking. It's a recognised thing, and there's loads of literature on it. But it doesn't. The medical literature, they don't seem to engage with any other disciplines. So it's just not been. It doesn't get mentioned ever. There's a lot about in the guidance about if the behaviour is only seen in front of the mum, and nowhere does it mention masking and how different people behave in different ways. There's already a lot of literature about misogyny and ableism, so we're often talking about press groups anyway that are being accused of it. And there's also the processes, the safeguarding processes. You have a child in need, and it's just, if it's because they're disabled, it's treated the same as an abused child. So they're going, so that makes the problem worse. I've got a good quote from someone I know. One of the greatest risks to autistic people is ignorant professionals. And I think that's true. If you've got more power than knowledge, sometimes people, and sometimes I think having a bit of knowledge is worse. If you think you know about autism, but you don't know there's some more subtle things, then that can be worse because then people could be more arrogant. But as worryingly, as well as misunderstandings, I also think that there's a lot to do with the environments, budgets, and basically unethical behaviour and abuse of power. So I think this was also from the Fightback research. 50% of accusations from their group had happened after complaint. So that sounds like it's a way of defending your career, silencing the parent. And it's part of the guidance. If you remember, it was people who make vexatious complaints, but obviously vexatious is in the opinion of the doctor, so it might not really be a vexatious complaint. If you're having a mum who you can't find anything wrong with the child and they're complaining about you, it's a way of protecting your career, also protecting budgets, because if it's expensive to provide support, you might have to come out of the school's budget, for example. So it's easy to say the mum's making it up, or dad, but really usually the mum. I better hurry up a bit, so I'm running out of time. But consequences. Mention some of these. Become afraid to ask for support going forward. Also, I know people who won't get a diagnosis for their autism for themselves, even that, but they self-identify because they don't want it in the notes, which means that they don't have access to the support. I mean, there's not a lot of support anyway, so it's a personal decision whether you get a diagnosis or not. But I think that's a shame that people are not doing it because they're scared because of the stigma. Some people do go on to lose their children, but I was watching. There's a really good video on. Is it Sinclair Law? I should try and find the link for you, put it in the chat after. but they did a Facebook video, a Facebook show about it, and he said in that, which I was glad to hear, that when it goes to court, they nearly always win now, because but I guess they've got a lot of experience in it. So I think that made me feel a bit better. And obviously, if the child, as well as the parent being traumatized, that has an effect on the children, and they might not be getting the medical help. Well, they won't be, because if the doctors aren't believing them, then they're not giving them treatment which they might need. This is the consequences for my participant. It destroyed my marriage. I walked away from a relationship with my parents. I couldn't cope with it. It was a difficult relationship anyway, but I couldn't cope with the things that I'd learned that had happened during my childhood and the things that they had said about me. So I left that. My children decided to stay with my husband. And really, being a woman who leaves a husband is not a good place to be. And a woman who leaves a husband and children is just something society doesn't really readily accept at all. This is a lady who I know, who I spoke to on the phone. I had to go to a CP and I was absolutely shaking. I literally thought I was going to die. I thought, I don't want to live if they think I'm abusing my children. I literally don't want to live. And I didn't know how I was going to get through it. I really didn't know how I was going to get through it. I should have given a trigger warning for that, really, because that one, it is quite upsetting when you read that. And this is just a mum who was trying to get the right support for her child, who did go on to get lots of diagnoses, including I think EDS was one. So now I've scared everybody to death. Got some advice for some tips for the things you can do if you're accused, or trying to prevent it. Keep evidence for things. So keep all your paperwork really organised, which I know for people like me who I have really bad executive functioning issues and planning and organising. So that is hard. But keep all your paperwork in an organised manner. Record meetings. This is even before. This is just not necessarily when you're accused, but just generally, it's a good thing to do. You are allowed to record meetings if they're for personal use. You don't have to tell anybody if you don't want, because I have asked to record my doctor's appointments before, and some people don't like it, even though it's a reasonable adjustment and they should say yes, but sometimes they don't. Keep a note of all your phone calls and appointments. I think I got these from the Fightback website as well, because they've got good advice in there, but don't use medical terminology, or if you do, say Dr. So-and-so says. Take somebody with you, someone who knows a child. Like I started taking my husband to things, or sometimes my husband will go and do the doctor's appointment, but it's hard because he's at work, so it's a lot easier if I can just go. But he's been being more involved. Record if it's something that they don't believe, like when you're having big meltdowns at home, for example, or things like if the joint sublux and then by the time you get to A&E, gone back in, because that happens in our house sometimes. Taking pictures or recording. Get knowledgeable, but again, like I said, not being knowledgeable can be seen as a sign, but that doesn't mean, I guess it doesn't mean you can't get knowledgeable, but just be careful not to be telling the doctor why he's wrong all the time, even if that's what you think. Social media is great for finding peer support, so definitely I would recommend using it, but be really careful what you post. Set it on private, because things can be used against you. I put some examples of people who might be able to give support. There's also the groups who are here today, like Define Fine, or Not Fine in School is their Facebook group. PACT. I don't know if but do it as well. You can say afterwards if you support people, but the Fightback one is a Facebook group, and some of these others are paid, unfortunately, which is another problem, because not everyone can afford to have paid ones, so we need more free support, I think, which is hard to get because people need to be paid for their work, really. Right, Right, that's my email address at university, or I'm Shona Louise Murphy at yahoo.co.uk for my personal one. If anybody has any questions, I think we're going to have a break now. I'll be able to have a look at the chat as well and see if there are any questions in there while we have a break. But I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, that's me done.
Thank you so much, Shona. Thank you. You have, it was a very sobering talk. It was really, really informative.
I need to get some of, because there are positive stories, aren't there? I need to get some of the ones where success stories, because it's just got that, yeah, I need to put something in about your story, because it's just negative ones at the moment.
Yeah.
But when I do my research, hopefully I'll hear a whole load of different stories, both positive.
Okay.
Negative.
We're going to have a 5-minute break now, just so that you can all leave your screens and go and get a drink, walk around a bit, stretch. But perhaps, Mary, when we come back, would you be able to tell a little bit about your success? And then we'll just open for general discussion. So the time is now 10 to